Today I've come to the pottery making village of Mata Ortiz in northern Mexico, and I'm going to show you how they make their pottery here. But I'm not going to approach it like a tourist or like a pottery collector. Instead, I'm going to do something that I haven't seen done before. I'm going to approach the pottery of Mata Ortiz from the perspective of a potter. So we're going to be doing a deep dive on the methods and the techniques that they use here to make their beautiful pottery. So come with me and let's explore the pottery of Mata Ortiz, Chihuahua. Now here in Mata Ortiz, they do sometimes use commercial products to make their pottery. But as far as I could determine, all the clay they use comes from the earth dug locally in that area. Of all the potters I talked to, it seemed like everyone had their own distinct type of clay that they used, their own recipe, their own sources for clay. So there may be as many different recipes for clay as there are potters in this village, but all the clay that they use does come from the local earth. Now Miguel Lopez has agreed to take me out here and show me where he digs clay. And so this is what he's doing here. The one big mystery I never did solve with Mata Ortiz clay is that nobody seems to add temper to their clay, or at least they don't seem to have any knowledge of temper when I ask them about it. But this material that Miguel is digging here is very unclay-like. It's gritty. It doesn't have any characteristics that I would look at it in nature and say, this looks like clay, I want to take this back to my studio and test it out. So it's possible that this material is temper, that this is just some kind of volcanic ash that they're adding to their clay body. And maybe they don't call it temper. Maybe they call it all barro, even though it's not. I don't know. I'm just saying that I never could get a good answer about temper. This is Miguel's wife, Adelene. So they took me out back of their house and kind of ran me through all the steps that they use to process clay. Their clay body is formed by mixing clay from 3 different sources. And they store the clay in these big bins in their yard. And each of those clays are very distinctive. None of them feel especially pure, and that might be the trick to not having temper here, in that these clays naturally contain a certain amount of volcanic ash or silt or some kind of grit that is acting as the temper. When they're ready to mix up a batch of clay, the clay is put into these large tubs covered with water and soaked. When the clay is done soaking, it's stirred and mixed up, which makes the clay particles suspended in the water temporarily. With the clay particles suspended in the water, the material is then put in a bucket and poured through a screen. This step is repeated over and over again, with more water being added to the original tub and stirred up, and then that material poured through the screen, until the water in the original tub has very little color to it. It's kind of see-through. Then they know that they've got most of the clay out of it. They can throw the rest away. In these tubs, the clay settles to the bottom, and the water rises to the top. This water is removed. I don't know if they skim it off the top or siphon it or pour it off, but at any rate, water is taken out of the tubs. Once it's the right consistency, the clay is transferred to these barrels and screened again because it might have picked up some impurities while it was sitting in the tub. In the barrel, it can be covered and kept clean. This shallow cloth-lined trough with bricks on the bottom and wood sides is the final step in removing the water from the clay so that it's usable in making pottery. The semi-liquid clay is covered up to keep contaminants out and allowed to dry further in these trays. Eventually, the clay is moved to the concrete floor of the studio to complete its drying process. Sabino Villalba's process for clay is very similar, although you'll notice that his clay is a totally different color. He uses 1 ingredient in his clay instead of the 3 that Miguel used. And Sabino tells me that he adds nothing else to the material except that clay from whatever source it's from. Now, look at the way he's straining this through a shirt. That's a very fine sieve. I can't imagine any temper material passing through that shirt. And yet, he adds no temper to his clay. So there must be something in that clay that's acting as temper that is extremely fine. Once he's done, he places it into this shallow trough that is just the same as what Miguel uses with the bricks on the bottom, puts a sheet in it, and lets it dry.
Very cool.
Gloria Hernandez processes her clay in a way that is also similar but different. She uses a screen that is not as tight as Sabino's, but is probably tighter than Miguel's. Her granddaughter Leslie keeps the clay stirred up in the first container while she pours it through the screen into the second container. She says that she actually performs this same process 6 times for each clay to make sure it's the finest, most pure clay it can be. Her recipe mixes clay from 2 different sources, and again, is a slightly different color and different texture from the other potters. In the end, she pours it into a wooden trough very similar to the other potters and lets it dry. Sure, in a sheet like this. Yes. Northern Chihuahua was the center of the last great cultural florescence in the region known today as the American Southwest. There, in the time between about 1250 to 1450 AD, developed the Casas Grandes culture, which made some of the most beautiful pottery in prehistoric North America. Types such as Ramos, Caretas, and Corralitos polychrome, to name just a few, have stunned and excited archaeologists and collectors alike. This culture was centered around the massive Pueblo ruins called Paquime, which are located about 87 miles south of the U.S.-Mexican border. The culture extended out from there in all directions, reaching clear into southeastern Arizona and southwest New Mexico. Paquime is estimated to have contained 2,000 rooms that reached at least 3 stories in height, and numerous ceremonial architectural features such as platform mounds, effigy mounds, and ball courts. The artwork and crafts produced there were exquisite and included shell jewelry, carved stone, copper bells, and of course, polychrome pottery. Mata Ortiz lies close to the heart of the Casas Grandes culture, being only about 20 miles south of the ruins of Paquime. Many Casas Grandes ruins lie all along the Palanganas River, which runs right past Mata Ortiz. The pottery left behind when these people abandoned this region around 1450 AD provided the original inspiration for Mata Ortiz pottery. As for the tools used to form pottery here in Mata Ortiz, we have the clay, which we've already talked about. You got the water bowl, which you need. We've got what I would call a puki, what they call a molde, and are usually formed from plaster of Paris here. And then you've got the ubiquitous hacksaw blade, which they call a ceueta. And Mary is using, looks like an upholsterer's needle. I see most commonly used an epidermic needle in Mata Ortiz. And she also has this small plastic disc, which you'll see used pretty soon. The potter here is Mary Chavira, and I'm probably ruining the pronunciation of these names, so I apologize right off the bat. And she is working today in the kitchen of her mother's home. Her mother's name is Montse Hernandez. And they were just the nicest people who made us feel very welcome.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Sí, una tortilla de
Potters of Mata Ortiz work in a very similar fashion to traditional potters around the Southwest. They start with a flat slab of clay that they call a tortilla, and they push that into their molde or puki. Here Mary is being conscious to get rid of any air bubbles she sees in that slab.
Nice pancake.
Tortilla.
Sí.
Tortilla, yeah,
Tortilla.
true.
They call that a tortilla.
Yeah.
And just like that coil, they call it chorizo. Oh, geez, there.
Yeah. We call it a pancake. We call it a pancake, you know.
The tortilla.
Ah, sí, Nikki.
And pookie.
A la tortilla, a la tortita y al chorizo le llamamos bobina y el puki es tu molde.
Ah.
Now here you can see her using that green plastic disc, just the same way I would use a gourd scraper to smooth the inside of the pot to press it down into that molde good. She's going to trim off the top and roll her first coil, which is all very similar to the way I work. In Mata Ortiz, a coil of clay is called a chorizo. What you will notice here is the size of the coils in Mata Ortiz are very, very large. So it almost reminds me of back when I first started my channel, I was doing something called the One Coil Challenge, where I would see how big a pot I could make from one coil of clay. And so these Mata Ortiz coils are very, very large. And then they just spend a lot of time pinching that thinner and pinching it up. As you can see her doing here, I've sped this up so you can actually see the walls of the pot rise. The steps for coil building a pot that I often give in my lessons are coil, bond, pinch, scrape, and repeat as necessary. And you can see she's going through essentially the same process here. She scraped the outside, now she's created a coil, she's bonding it to the pot, she'll pinch it up. And you can see also as she builds, she's using smaller coils as she starts building that neck. I believe there are 3 coils total in this pot.
Yeah.
Es que hago mucha mini.
Tension.
Bueno.
Okay. Blanco, they got Blanco over there.
Con crédito.
Now as Mary gets close to finishing this pot, you'll notice that she doesn't spend a lot of time getting a nice smooth finish or working on the rim. And that is because they sand these pots after they're fully dry. And I'll go into that in more detail in the next chapter of this video. But just remember that for now, at this stage, they don't spend a lot of time smoothing it because they sand later. This discussion about Mata Ortiz potters would not be complete if I didn't at least mention the generosity of these people. Here we are in their home filming them making pottery, and they make us a meal.
Oh, Julius, green. How do you say this?
Ejotes.
Jotes?
Ejotes.
Ejotes. We say green bean,
Sí.
tomato.
Ajá.
Yeah.
One thing seen frequently in Mata Ortiz is clay drying on the floor. So as the clay that they've already processed gets closer to the desired texture and consistency, it's often wrapped up and placed on the floor until it dries to the proper consistency.
You make a ball.
Here we are in the home of Sabino, who we met earlier, and his wife Veronica. And they're working together to form a decorative plate today.
Yeah, you'd be surprised what my clay feels like.
Very good in the hand. Muy bueno. You see?
Animals in the plate because
Oh, I've seen some of those.
hieroglyph.
There's one at the house where we're staying. You see what he's doing, Tanya? He cut out the little sheep.
Yours. Need a really small thing.
Tucson,
Arizona.
okay.
And
Andres
Oh,
Villalba, that's Sabino's father.
it's got a parrot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the parrot design is cool.
Mm-hmm.
Very pretty.
Very nice.
Oh.
Yeah. And there's
Like
different
inside.
like. Then you can do this.
Muy bonito.
Ya va agarrando forma, poco a poco.
And now we come to the studio of Diego Valles, who is working on a very large pot today. But before we get into his pot building, let's look at the tools he uses. Here's Diego's toolbox. And you can see some of the usual Mata Ortiz tools, like the hypodermic needle. And what else has he got in here? Well, we've got these knife blades. These probably function just about the same as the hacksaw blades we looked at, the cehuetas. And then he also has these spoon bowls, spoons with the handles cut off, which I imagine you could use inside the pot for scraping it. And then he's got like a credit card that's been cut into a rounded shape. And what else have we got in here? Oh, the ubiquitous hacksaw blade. And a piece of PVC pipe, which is seen all over Mata Ortiz for rolling out slabs. And some more spoons, which are great for reaching down inside hard to reach places. You can tell that Diego makes a lot of large jars because he's got some of the biggest pukis or moldes I've seen anywhere, even in Mata Ortiz. Look at the size of these. Also in Diego's studio today is his apprentice, Alan Cano, who's also building a pretty large jar today. And so we'll go back and forth between the two of these as they build these jars. Diego said the clay he was using today was wetter than he wanted, and so he kept having trouble with it. because it was wetter than he'd like. I believe the wetness of his clay was the reason that he's using smaller than usual coils for Mata Ortiz, and also why he had to resort to a hairdryer to try to dry out this pot before he added more coils to it. Eventually, Diego and Alan had to break for lunch. At that time, I left to go explore other corners of Mata Ortiz. And when I came back a few hours later, the pots were done. Didn't they come out beautiful?
Por el color blanco.
And our final potters, who are going to show us how they build pots, is Miguel and Adelene again. And you will see that they work together as an unbeatable team to crank out pots at a ridiculously fast rate. They are the lightning potters, el alfareros relámpagos.
Lo ponemos arriba y hasta abajo. Este se lo ponemos a Adilene para que Adilene se lo pegue a la olla esta.
Bueno, hasta aquí también es mi proceso y así que...
Y luego enseguida yo. Sí. Ok, más o menos. Ahora vamos a cortar para el pico.
Aquí con la sayeteada para abajo, lo que estamos haciendo es pegando el churro de arriba.
Y listo.
Excelente. The total build time for these two pots that they built together was less than 17 minutes. I wasn't kidding when I called them the lightning potters.
¿Listo?
Gracias. Gracias.
Son dos ollas similares, es una pieza sin pico y una pieza con pico.
We had some trouble getting to Mata Ortiz. So when you cross the border and you're going more than 16 miles from the border, then there's certain paperwork you have to do. One piece of paperwork is like a tourist visa that you have to get for yourself, permission for yourself to visit deeper into Mexico. And the second is if you're driving a vehicle, you have to get a pass to drive that vehicle down into Mexico. And you put up a bond for your vehicle that you get back when you go back across the border. So when we went to get our tourist visas, the man behind the counter, the official, realized that our passports had expired. We didn't know it because they last for like 10 years. And so he said, well, your passport is expired. And we thought we were gonna have to cancel our whole trip. And then he said, I'm gonna go ahead and give you these tourist visas, but you need to get this taken care of before your next trip to Mexico. And we said, sure, that's fine. And we appreciated that. And we went on our way. Then when we went to get our truck taken care of, the pass to get our truck down, they looked at all the paperwork that was relevant. For example, our registration and our insurance and all that. And then she asked to see my passport. And the first thing she did was notice that that passport was expired, and she denied me entry. So what were we supposed to do? We almost drove home. And then I said, well, look, we still have permission to visit Mexico. Only our truck can't go. If only we could get a ride from the border to Mata Ortiz. And so I talked to a friend of mine in Mata Ortiz, and we got somebody to take us down. Luis and his wife Betty drove us from the border at Palomas, Chihuahua, there by Columbus, New Mexico, down to Mata Ortiz for a fee. And then when we got here, well, it's a pretty small village, so we actually could have walked anywhere we needed to go, but it would have taken some time. But it gets even better. When we got here, somebody lent us a truck, and so we had wheels the whole time we were here. And so that's the story of how I spent 5 days in Mexico on an expired passport.
I could see a little kid about 10 or 12 thinking this was the greatest thing ever.
Now let's look into how they finish their pots in Mata Ortiz. Once the pots have been formed and allowed to dry a little bit, you can pop them out of the puki, or what they call a molde, and start scraping the bottom. You've always got that mark where it sits in the mold at the bottom where there's a little lip, a little rim. And so you can see that Miguel here is just scraping that all off and then scraping it down nice and smooth. After that, you let the pot dry fully. Then it's time to sand. They do a lot of sanding in Mata Ortiz. That's how they achieve that really lustrous, polished finish. So you can see Mary here, she's got 3 kinds of sandpaper. 80 grit, 180 grit, and 220 grit. So she has to sand each pot 3 times with each grade of sandpaper to get it nice and smooth. And that's before she starts polishing or painting. And so I don't have a lot of video of the sanding process because there's really not a lot to show. Just sanding the pot. It's the most boring, mundane task involved in making Mata Ortiz pottery. But once it's sanded, you can get on to the polishing step, which I promise is fascinating. So here Veronica is applying oil to the sanded and dry pot. In this case, she's using furniture oil, but they use a lot of different kinds of oil here in Mata Ortiz. After she's coated it in oil, she waits a minute for it to dry and soak in. Not very long, maybe a minute or 2 at most. And then she applies water to that. So here's a rag with water on it that you can see she just puts the water right on top of it. And then again, she kind of gives it a minute for that to soak in and not to have excess water on the surface. You can see she uses this rag to buff off any excess water. And then she begins polishing with a smooth stone. And you can see the pottery develops a really beautiful, almost mirror-like finish right away as she starts polishing.
For the fire.
Like a pre-fire. Sometimes
Whee! That
we
is
put it
super
in
shiny.
there first. Like,
Gloria uses a similar process to polish her large Hoya. But because it's so large, she has to do it in stages. So first of all, she covers the entire pot with oil. In this case, she's using an oil that's made for treating leather on saddles. Once the pot is entirely covered in oil, she has to wait a few minutes for that oil to soak into the pot before she begins polishing. To soak in.
Puntería de motor.
Mm-hmm.
Sí.
Yeah.
Okay.
Next, she
Okay.
adds water. But instead of covering the entire surface like Veronica did, she covers just a small area that she can polish at one time, and then moves on and does the pot in stages. So using a sponge, she just applies a little bit of water, and then using a larger sponge, she kind of helps dry it out and remove any excess before she starts polishing. To start with, she does sort of a rough polish using this engine push rod. Then once she's got that all covered, she puts that aside and picks up a smooth rock to do the final finished polish. After that area is completely polished, she picks up her sponge and water and wets a new area and begins the process over again. In this way, in stages, she slowly works her way around the entire pot. Now that's the one you put the diesel on. The diesel.
Sí.
No, sí.
Dice.
Diesel.
La pintura.
Pintura es manganizo y grafito.
No,
manganese. Barro y manganese. Sí. Clay and manganese. That is a recipe I know well. So in case you missed that exchange, she first coated the pot in a liberal coat of diesel fuel. And I didn't catch that on camera, but it's not a big deal. She just coated it in diesel with using that sponge in the cup right there. Then she waited a couple minutes for it to dry fully. Now she is applying a layer of manganese and clay mixed together with water. And so now she's applying that with a sponge all over the pot. And so this is basically a slip. I haven't seen a lot of slips used in Mata Ortiz, but this is a slip if it's just clay and manganese. The interesting thing is she doesn't give it two coats. She doesn't make it especially heavy. I mean, when she's done, as you'll see, you can still see through it quite a bit. But it does give it a blackness. And then she's going to add some more blackness to it in a minute here.
Vamos a esperar un momento que se seque.
See?
Say again.
Graphite? Yeah, see?
Un ratito.
This is powdered graphite that they obtain commercially somewhere. And so she's adding this to the container, and she's going to mix it up with diesel. So in this little, I think it's a Gatorade bottle, she has some diesel fuel. So she mixes the graphite with the diesel, and then this gets applied to the pot over the top of that manganese and clay slip that was already added.
Que si tú hablas en español, ellos van a saber. No, pero ya vamos a poner el grafito.
Wow, look at that. Look at it, just comes alive.
Con una esponja.
Amazing. Manganese as the base layer and then that graphite over the top. I wonder what it would... Huh. Well, you wouldn't just mix the graphite and the manganese together like applying in coats. Once this step is completed, they wait at least another 20 minutes for it to dry fully before they start polishing it. I'm on the side of the road near Casas, Chihuahua, and if there's one thing I know what to look for, or what looks like, and that is a clay quarry. So there's a spot on the side of the road here that's all dug out in this bank. Now, I was looking for clay. I was thinking about clay when I was down here. All the ground around here is that reddish brown color. Looks nothing like the color of Ramos polychrome. So I kept thinking, where is that stuff coming from? And crossing this little hill, and this whole bank is dug out. Potters have been in here digging. Potters have been in here digging recently. You can even see like marks, you know, where a tool, a pick or something has been working. So pretty cool. It's easy to find these little spots when you're looking for it, where somebody's been digging and then stop, and that's a, you know, it's a good sign that there's clay. Anyways, pretty interesting. White. It's definitely clay too. You can see by the texture of it, a little bit crackly, Those angular chunks. It's also very, very ashy, but it's definitely clay. Interesting stuff. This has to be, I mean, may not be the exact source, but it's something like this that they were using for Ramos polychrome. Interesting. Having collected a bag of this clay, I took it back to my lodging in Mata Ortiz and ran a little test on it. I put it in a container, put some water on top of it, so I could see how much clay was in it. I let it soak for a few hours and then kind of just ran it through my fingers to see what the texture was like. And the results are, it definitely has a lot of clay in it, but it also has a lot of grit in it. The way they process clay here at Mata Ortiz would definitely clean this up and make it usable. How usable, I had no way of saying. I would have loved to have taken the whole bag of clay home with me, but the customs will not allow raw, unprocessed clay across the border. It has to be processed. And I did not have time in the few days I had left of my trip to process a whole bag of clay. So I left it in Mata Ortiz, but the big takeaway for me, being a replicator, was that I had found a white-ish clay near the ruins of Paquime, which, you know, to me is important, or a big deal. So I found this corn grinder there, similar to what I use for grinding clay, except they don't use it to grind clay. They don't dry process their clay. They use the corn grinder to make paint. So this is the native manganese that they use here. They grind it up, they mix it with clay, and I don't know if there's other ingredients or not, I really don't know. But they make paint themselves out of natural manganese that they harvest in the local area. And that is really the foundation for their fine painting. The other thing that's important for their painting are these brushes. They make these brushes themselves from the hair of small children. So very small children have super fine hair that makes the finest brushes for painting. All the potters that I observed painting in Mata Ortiz were all using these handmade children's hair brushes. Now let's look at an example of these brushes and this paint being used together. Here's Sabino, and he's about to start painting that plate that we saw Veronica polishing recently. ¿La pintura la haces tú mismo?
Sí.
Yeah. Manganese?
Sí, manganeso. con
Manganeso,
barro.
okay.
Sí.
Very fast. I paint much slower than that.
Esta,
Scrapes it off.
¿sí?
Yeah.
Ajá. Esto es para el dibujo.
I think if I did that with my paint, I would smear it all over the pot.
Creo que si hiciera eso con mi pintura, la untaría por todo el bote.
Necesita el jabón.
The soap keeps it from smearing.
El jabón evita que se manche.
Sí.
Yeah.
Ajá.
Jose and Celia are two artists in Mata Ortiz that do the very fine, detailed painting on pots. As you can see here, this kind of painting takes hours to complete, but the results speak for themselves. Now you might notice that the color of the clay body is black. Now, this isn't a slip. It's actually made with black clay, and the reason is they add manganese right to the clay, which is a pretty neat idea. On the other hand, manganese is toxic to inhale. So think about these pots. When they sand them, there's manganese in the air, you would want to have a good respirator, or maybe not even be around when one of these manganese pots is being sanded. But they paint on this black clay with bright colors, in this case red and white. But in other cases, they use commercial underglazes on some of these. So you'll see blues and greens and yellows and colors that are not natural occurring. But it really makes a striking, beautiful pot with these bright colors on the black background. These are finished pots that are dry and are waiting to be sanded and polished and painted. Once the designs are outlined in the black manganese paint, then in order to make the traditional Casas Grandes polychrome, in between those black lines is filled in with red paint, as you see Veronica doing here.
That one clay is make the paint red, and it's yellow, but when fire, it's red.
Yes.
Change color.
Like super smooth.
Then we get paid. So like.
And that lubricates it so that it doesn't scratch.
Yes.
The last common design technique in Mata Ortiz that we're going to look at today is sgraffito. There is a surprising amount of beautiful sgraffito work being done in Mata Ortiz today. And as you can see, this pot was painted with commercial underglazes. You don't get those blues and greens from natural materials. And then she's scratching out around them, which really provides more definition to the design and really makes them pop. So how did the pottery making tradition get started in Mata Ortiz in the first place? Well, it's the same old story. Boy finds pottery sherds. Boy falls in love with ancient pottery. Boy decides he's going to try to recreate some of that pottery. Boy's obsession with pottery changes the course of his entire life. It's happened to a lot of people I know. People like John Olson and Tony Soares and even myself. And it happened to a man named Juan Quezada who grew up in Mata Ortiz. And it's said that in the 1950s, while he was still a teenager, he started to experiment with local clays and minerals to try to reproduce the beautiful ancient Casas Grandes pottery that was found in that area. And with the way those kind of things go, it took him a long time of experimentation and trial and error to get success. But by the early 1970s, he was creating convincing replicas of ancient Casas Grandes pottery, pots that he found a ready market for with collectors north of the border. Juan's success inspired others in the village to try pottery. He taught what he had learned to friends and family. Others began doing their own experiments with local clays and minerals. In 1976, an anthropologist named Spencer McCallum bought some of Juan's pottery from a junk store in Deming, New Mexico. He then traveled south into Chihuahua, trying to track down who had made the pots, which led him to Juan Quezada's doorstep. The two men came to an agreement whereby Spencer would pay Juan to make pots. This allowed Juan the freedom to experiment and improve in his craft without the economic pressure to have to make pots quickly. In the 1980s, the quality of the pottery coming out of Mata Ortiz increased rapidly, as did the number of active potters in the village. It is estimated that by the late 1980s, there were around 300 potters at work in the village. At the same time, the notoriety of Mata Ortiz pottery was rapidly increasing in the United States, and more people began collecting it. Since that time, the quality of the pottery made here has continued to improve, and today there is pottery being made in every corner of the village. Imagine being a young person growing up in a pottery-making village like Mata Ortiz. You would not need to go through all the experiments and trial and error that early trailblazers like Juan Quezada had to do. It's the same with the pottery-making pueblos in the United States. There's always a family friend or an uncle or an aunt who is willing to teach you what you need to know to get started. But for those of us interested in making traditional pottery, who aren't in pottery-making communities like that, the road to progress can be winding and the learning curve steep. This is the advantage of the Ancient Potters Club. It's like a virtual village of more experienced potters who are willing and able to help you make progress. We meet together over Zoom every week to make pottery together, and we post tips and questions via our Discord community throughout the week. I can be like your weird old pottery making uncle who helps you out with your pottery skills. Join the Ancient Potters Club and call me T.O. Andy. I'll put the link to that on the screen here and down in the doobly-doo in case you're interested in learning more about the Ancient Potters Club. Sabino is here this evening getting ready to fire that beautiful plate that we saw in his studio earlier in the day. So this is what I would call the primary fire. It's just getting everything warmed up and ready to go.
Este es de este.
Oh, so pretty.
Desde aquí.
Oh no, this one's different. See, he
Sí,
doesn't go with
diferente.
that one. Differente, yeah.
Sí.
Yeah, like maybe this go with that. Oh. Wait. No. Well, like, try.
Thank you. What are you doing?
¿Cómo se llama?
¿Cómo se llama?
Gabriela.
Gabriela.
It might appear when you're watching the video that it's all happening pretty fast, but these steps were spread out quite a bit, so everything's warming up really slow. So first they warmed up this metal tub for a while, then they put the plate inside and they let that warm up for quite a while. So now that you see them stacking the fuel, the plate has already been in there for a bit, and so it really has had a lot of time to preheat slowly in this fire before they start fueling it. So the fuel here is mostly cow manure, but there are a few pieces of split cottonwood added to it.
Nice.
Listo. Good. Yeah. See.
Bueno.
And then the cool down period is also equally long. He lets it sit here, even after he's removed the fuel from it, he lets it sit here in this tub for a long time before he opens it up. Now here's a look inside Sabino and Veronica's studio, just to see some of the pots that they made today, all sitting here drying.
Let's see that.
So they've had a very busy day. Now he let this cool with the lid on it for quite a while. Now he's taking the lid off. He's still going to let it cool for a bit longer before he pulls it out of the tub. So he's letting the cool down take place very slowly because he doesn't want to crack it. And so by the time he finally pulls it out, it's after dark. So the whole process took quite a while to complete. Slowly heating it up and slowly cooling it down.
Very nice. It's got the little heart in there. Very cool.
This is how I met Mary. I was just driving down the road and I saw someone firing pottery, so I stopped and talked to them. So this is a smudge fire for blackware. So you see this tray of horse manure here? She probably put some of that under the sagger before she started the fire. That way it kind of carbonizes, it gets hot, creates a smoky atmosphere in there, and the pots underneath the sagger will be impregnated with that carbon, turning them black. And so you'll see that over the pots there's this big metal tub that's sitting right down on the ground. That way no air can get in there because she's trying to smudge the pots. And now she's just letting it cool down real slow. So once the fire's burned to coals, she pulls those coals away and then she leaves it for quite a few minutes to just sit there and cool down on its own slowly. Then she'll come over, she'll pull the dirt away, and then she'll leave it sit and cool some more. Just trying to prevent that thermal shock by letting it cool down nice and slow. And finally, once she thinks it's cooled down enough, she'll get 2 pieces of firewood and lift that sagger off, and we can finally see the beautiful black pottery underneath.
Sentí que raspé una.
I drink the kind that's diet usually. So this It's my hood.
Ah,
Different.
buena.
Yeah. 'Cause,
Que la de allá.
We've been really fortunate in that the weather during our trip was actually really good, which, you know, for a trip in January, it can be really hit and miss. As you can see, it's raining today, but we've had 4 really beautiful days, and so today is the day that we're getting ready to go. We've made some really great friends here. The people in this village have been so warm and welcoming and kind. They've taken us into their homes, they've fed us, they've given us things, they've just made us feel welcome. Today, Luis is on his way down here. He's going to pick us up and drive us back to the border. If you enjoyed this video about how they make pottery here in Mata Ortiz, I've done other videos having to do with how different groups in the Southwest make pottery. So you might enjoy this one over here about how the Hopis make pottery. I appreciate you coming on our trip with us today. We'll catch you next time.